Hey, welcome back to Paradigm Sherpas. We've got Dr. Todd Penner here today. He's got a lot to tell us about the Bible. He's got a PhD in religion from Emory University, focused on the New Testament and Christian origins in the ancient world. So he's very well suited to help us out with our understanding. I had a bunch of questions for him about, what is the Bible? How is it made? How are we supposed to interpret it? What does it have to say about Jesus, or rather, what did Jesus actually say that, that's within the Bible? And we go over a whole bunch of other stuff. Dr. Penner talks about how our modern day political discourse and how we debate about, the Constitution and what we should focus on and what counts is very similar to the iterations and debates about the biblical texts and, the Christian religion as a whole. So buckle up, enjoy. Dr. Penner is super chill guy, wildly knowledgeable, and extremely humble and kind with his time to be here today to, share a life's worth of wisdom that he's worked hard to acquire as it relates to, an understanding of the Bible. So thanks, everybody, for joining. Without further ado, we welcome today's Paradigm Sherpa, Dr. Todd Penner. One of the things that really called to me, that screamed hey, I have to reach out to Dr. Penner when I thought about putting these conversations out for people to hear was, I grew up in a household that was we went to Sunday school, church every Sunday. We were religious, but it was kind of the, cling to the kind of morals, the, don't kill people, don't be jealous, maybe the 10 Commandment kind of thing, but not, I guess, the golden rule, be a good person, things that people interpreted or drew out of the Catholic experience. And I don't know, when I got to a certain point that the church, the bureaucracy of it, my knowledge of the history of it, things like the Crusades or the Inquisition, it made me start to question some of the things I was taught, I guess. And, I got to a point where I wanted to actually revisit religion and the Bible as an adult, from my own kind of fresh view versus what was fed to me as I grew up. And something that, stood out to me was you introduced me to this idea of the Bible not being a singular book, but a series of texts that are put together, written over a vast time span by tons of different people, many of whom probably never had direct contact with the person we identify as Jesus Christ. And so, I don't know, I was wondering if maybe you could start us off with a keeping us honest of what do you think, what is the Bible in a general summary to you? And I know it's a huge task to ask to summarize.
Question, right?
Yeah.
Right. Well, first, thank you for having me on your podcast, Ryan. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be here and humbled. It's a joy to see you again. So the Bible. So I think the first thing, and just listening to your opening comments, one of the things, and this is something I often, one of the first things I start off with students and telling them, I think it's kind of an important, because so many people have these attachments to the Bible. The Bible's done this to me, or the Bible represents this, right? And generally speaking, at least as a starting premise, one can complicate it later, I suppose, but is that the Bible doesn't actually ever do anything to anyone. People do things with the Bible. And if the Bible weren't there, let's say, the Bible had never been here, people would still be doing the things. There'd still be crusades. There'd still be indoctrination. There would still be structures of domination and oppression, religious and otherwise, with or without the Bible, because that's what people do. And in some ways, I find the Bible really helpful to think about, in part, in our contemporary culture, because the Constitution is being used in much way the Bible has been, and people, the struggles that people, and it's not by accident. A lot of the interpretive traditions that go into the constitutional American constitutional struggles over interpretation are derived from the techniques that come out of biblical interpretation, which makes sense for a country so tied to the Bible that that those techniques would be applied to other kinds of scriptures, such as the Constitution. But yeah, I think it's helpful to think that whatever people do with the Bible and have done with the Bible is something that reflects on people. The Bible is, in some sense, can be deployed for any number. If it can be a great source of healing, right, for people, and has been for many individuals. But at the same time, I've met a lot of people for whom the Bible was used as a kind of a tool of domination and oppression and hurt, causing pain, suffering, trauma, or is identified as kind of the source of that. So I think it's really, I mean, I grew up in a very conservative religious environment, and I spent a lot of time there in that environment. And I don't, I, you know, I, there's always a period of time, I think, where you look back and you know, can be led to reject certain portions of that past, and I've certainly been there. But I've also come to appreciate other aspects, and to find the places where I've actually learned a lot about resilience, for instance, from those very same traditions. Going to your point, I guess the other point about the Bible being a collection of, I like to say, voices over time. You have the Hebrew Bible, Old Testament, and you have the New Testament, and you have the Apocrypha. You have this whole collection. Depending on your tradition, you will you mentioned you're a Catholic. Is that right?
Well, yeah,
Growing up.
I would say now I'm in that category of people that, you know, I listened to a talk you gave a while ago about spiritual but not religious, like a,
Uh-huh.
I'm certainly grateful for my Catholic upbringing because, you know, like you said, I may have been one of those people that ran away from religion for a period after
Right.
having that, but, you know, I've kind of circled back, and there's a lot of good things to this religion, and all religions really. You can find those nuggets of
Right.
usefulness, for good, hopefully. And like you
For
said,
good.
there's also people who can
Right.
find ways to leverage it for other means, but or ends rather. But
Well, yeah, and I think, just to your point then about the biblical tradition, is that it's rich, it's diverse, it's written and rewritten, and edited in multi-textual forms, and the degree to which people were actually eyewitnesses of events. I mean, and in some ways, it's I always say these, in many ways, these are inconsequential aspects about. I mean, we get hung up on, like, what happened, right? What things in the
yeah,
Bible happened. That's a very common kind of modernist question about the Bible. But in fact, the Bible itself, if you, and I often walk students through this, like, you think of something as radical as, like, the resurrection of Jesus, the stories of the resurrection of Jesus, or the Moses' parting of the Red Sea, to take two classic sort of, you know, traditions. And you'll get people who are like, these things happened. And I grew up in a tradition where we understood that these were historical events. It was very important that these were historical events, and taking the Bible literally meant that you accepted the historicity of it. Um, and over time, it occurred to me, and this is something that the German tradition has been very good at kind of elucidating, in part because of its rich hermeneutical understanding. This idea that interpretation really involves more than just looking at some words and, like, inferring, you know, inferring, like, straight from the text as if it were like a computer going to your brain, right? There's
Sure.
a lot of processes that are involved in the act of interpretation, and it occurred to me, and I talk to students about this a lot, and it's a helpful sort of paradigm to think about. Then both those instances, the resurrection of Jesus and the parting of the Red Sea by Moses, um, we might call foundational events for the formation of Judaism, and the resurrection for you could say a foundational event in the a mythological event in the formation of Christianity. Both of those, in some sense, they're, if you take them just as actual historical events, let's just say hypothetically for a moment, they're interesting. I mean, not just interesting. That's amazing. Like that. Wow,
Yeah.
that's really cool, right? Right.
Yeah.
But they say absolutely nothing. Like they have no meaning beyond. They have meaning in terms of like how we understand. They would have meaning scientifically, how we understand the physical limitations for at least certain individuals. For Moses
Yeah.
and Jesus, we don't know, right? Unless these are, Hume would say, unless we can replicate these across time and space, right? They don't. There's no. These aren't actual, verifiable miracle events, and that to me is like, yeah. So what actually gives these meaning in both Judaism and in Christianity? And one could then extend this to just about any religious tradition, particularly those traditions that are grounded in a kind of historical consciousness. That it's the interpretation that are given to those events in the traditions that
Mhm.
vivify them, that give them meaning. That Jesus' resurrection is like a person rose from the dead. Okay, so what? Yes, that's really cool, but so what? Well, it means it's like he's the firstborn of all creation. He died for your sins, right? But those are not inherent in the event itself, right? There's nothing inherent in that event that suggests that person dying is somehow going to forgive everyone's sins. Just like, Moses parting the Red Sea is the first act of the creation of 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 the Jewish people in some sense, right? Giving birth to.
Regardless of the historical exodus, whether that's real or not, it's powerful imagery to talk about birth here. When I look at an image of the parting of the Red Sea, I see the birth canal. I see the Red Sea. Well, not hard to imagine what that red fluid is, and then the being that is the collective people that are going through this canal into new life on the other side. Very powerful birth themes through the imagery of the parting of the Red Sea. So very appropriate in my mind to draw a parallel there. Not that it's the only parallel, but interesting to point out.
Right, bring, and there's going to be all of these other, glories that come to the people and so forth. But again, those are all interpretations of the act, right? And I think it's really important for people to separate those things out. I mean, people can get, just because people may argue that something happened or didn't happen, doesn't at all give meaning to these events. And I've always been interested in the meaning making process. I think that's actually where we need to stop and think about and focus our attention way more than on these very modern kind of scientific framework, and it's distinctively American in some ways, fundamentalist readings of the biblical text that come to read these events as literal, and focus our attention on the history in a way that's just unhelpful.
So another way that may be helpful of looking at the Bible instead of just a literal historical perspective is a mythological perspective. There's a book out there called Slaying the Dragon by Bernard Bato, Slaying the Dragon, Myth-Making in the Biblical Tradition, rather. And there's a great chapter on Exodus, which we were just talking about earlier, exploring it as a birthing type of metaphor. Other ways to look at the story of Exodus, from a mythical perspective, but also the entire Bible as a whole. So if you're curious to explore that way of giving meaning to the texts, I encourage you to check out Slaying the Dragon, or other works that support the mythical interpretations of at least some parts of the Bible. Okay, back to Dr. Penner now, graciously answering a question I had about sociological interpretations of the Bible.
I'm a trained historian. After all this, having just said all this stuff about it, I'm also a trained historian, and I am fascinated by how texts come together, and the kind of possibilities of how we might read these in context, right? In the context, in an ancient historical context, and I'm fully aware that everything, in some sense, doing history is like any other active interpretation. It's a conjecture, and it's impossible to extricate our kind of own sensibilities about the world from our understanding of ancient history. There's never, can't ever like hop in a time machine and go back, and even if you could, it would be meaningless, because you'd still have your modern mindset. You'd have to like have a mind erasing machine, and you'd have to be able to like adopt a kind of consciousness of a time period, right? And I don't think we exactly, it's impossible, right? And so I think these are the things that scholars, we're biblical scholars, I think, get hung up, is in this kind of drive for ever more nuanced, ever more like, picking apart, trying to get to the core of a historical event. And I'm more interested in broad historical, as you said, sociological patterns that exist in the world. I'm interested in learning. Ultimately, anything that we learn about the past is really there to inform us about the present. And it's helpful for me to think about the present in terms of the past. I don't think it's the only thing to inform the present, but it's a useful element. My current interests are much more aligned with. I mean, it's harder for me in the world we live in, which I feel, a lot of people are struggling. I mean, I was just today, the Washington Post had the headlines that, and it's just well known for a while, but the life expectancy in the United States is going down. In one of the, in a country that should not be the case, right? But why is it life expectancy going down? And there's a lot of tension and hypertension and stress, and we live in a world that's kind of constantly kind of eating us alive. I mean, as a kind of evolutionary organism, capitalism is basically the apex predator, and it doesn't matter where you are on its sort of on the great chain of being, with capitalism at the top. It's everyone's kind of like feeling it, right? Yeah. And so and I think I mean, even just chatting with you a little bit, it's clear that you've made decisions in your life, right, to kind of like prioritize like what's important to you, and how you want to live your life. And I think more and more people are kind of searching for that, and I think the Bible is a useful resource for thinking about these things, about people's struggles. I also think the role of the Bible in America is really useful. You see it playing out a lot even now. We're very free to quote Bible verses and do this and that, and to think about a little bit about what the kind of identities that were our own consciousness, if you will, right, in terms of how we might be more robust, healthier, less stressed, more open. That's a big part of it. I think that's the thing that the Bible, a lot of people think the Bible teaches you to be narrow-minded. I actually think one of the Bible's chief struggles, if you want to talk about the Bible now, is like think of it as a schizophrenic entity. Right? One of the struggles is in the biblical tradition is um, you know, somebody says this is the way it is, and then someone's like, well, I'm not quite so sure, right? It's one of the real strengths of the Jewish tradition, particularly, is the multivocal um, community expressions of the interpretive task, and the story of Job. I mean, it's one of my favorite books in the Bible. The story of Job is a good lesson, right?
Yeah.
This character Job is basically his entire life is ruined, and in some ways it's a contest between a chap by the name of the adversary, who we call Satan, but it's really in God's court as kind of a prosecuting attorney who's like, I want to test Job. He's he has everything. Of course he's righteous, and God's like, fine, test him if you want. It's your call. And so Satan tests him, takes everything away, right? The Satan takes everything away. And
Job's a really interesting place to check out in the Bible. As Dr. Penner was just describing, Job's this dude who is very righteous and family oriented and dedicated to God. And one day, this dude Hasatan comes by, who's basically Satan, and says, God, this guy Job is only, so faithful to you because he's got everything good going in his life. The moment shit hits the fan, this guy's going to turn on you, curse you, forget you, question you, etc. And so God says, all right, well, let's, see what happens if, shit does hit the fan for Job. So, go read about Job, see how, shit hits the fan for Job, what that does to his faith. And then also after you do that, taking the firsthand look at Job, go check out Carl Jung. He had a lot to say about the book of Job. A quick Wikipedia search, not very scholarly of me, but you can do your own research. But a quick Wikipedia page says that Jung considered the book of Job a landmark development in the divine drama, because for the first time, you contemplate the criticism of God, where people start looking back and criticizing God's judgment and opinions. And Jung's basic thesis of the book is that God actually has, it seems, a dark side, an evil side, and that this is the missing part of the Holy Trinity, and that the Trinity of the Bible should be replaced by a quaternity that acknowledges God's dark side for, being willing to do this to Job, who basically didn't deserve it. So yeah, go check out the book of Job. Really interesting story to reflect on suffering. One last point I want to just add is that it's not uncommon in religions across antiquity and all over the world and up to present day that do acknowledge potentially an evil side of God. If you've grown up in a Western classical Christian upbringing, it would be maybe a little unsettling to think of or consider that there might be an evil side of God. But Jung does think that this is what Job points out. So, something interesting to consider for sure.
And is this the first introduction of Satan in the Bible too, or is this?
Yeah, I mean, it depends a little bit on how there's an earlier instance of Satan in the off the top of my head, I'm going to say like the Davidic tradition, maybe, that during the census taking, I believe there's a mention of the Satan. But it's certainly the most systemic kind of introduction of this character.
Okay.
We call him, I say the Satan, because it's actually in Job at least, the character that we call Satan is actually a position, like prosecuting attorney is like represent, like that's so it's,
is that how it's
yes, that's right, yes, that's right, yeah, with the definite article in front, the Satan, right, yeah. And clearly it's a character, it's a individual who has some kind of relationship with God in terms of they're talking to each other, right? You do get, I mean, there's a whole the rise of Satan as in terms of how we think of Satan now is a long tradition and involves a lot of the pseudepigrapha and the melding of traditions from Ezekiel, for instance, in Isaiah, King of Tyre in Ezekiel gets allied with the day star. So prophecies against the King of Tyre and Augustine. So this goes well into the period of Augustine, and then of course Milton in Paradise Lost. Made Satan the star. I think.
Sure.
Made Satan the star. But it's a long tradition to get there.
Yeah.
And of course, but it's a good example, right? People now read Satan in the Bible and they're like, Satan's everywhere in the Bible. Well, not actually, no. By the time you get to the stories of Jesus, you do have Lucifer, a satanic character who, and there we think a lot of, I mean, at least for me, you see a lot of influence of Zoroastrian religious traditions in Judaism and Christianity as at least a good portion Jewish offshoot brings those Zoroastrian traditions in line to in varying degrees depending on where you look in the New Testament, and you get it in bigger doses when you get to the Gnostic traditions. There you get a kind of very interesting as the kind of development of our kind of concepts of divinity and so forth are to me just mind-boggling. The kind of traditions that have evolved over time. I was just reading yesterday, reading about doing some Kabbalistic study, which is all related to those same traditions, and it's just absolutely, again, it's all sort of intersecting and intercrossing.
Okay, so one of the traditions that Dr. Penner just mentioned was Kabbalism. And if you're interested in Kabbalism, it's known as Jewish mysticism. And off the cuff, the best way I could describe it, or my layman's understanding of it today, is that Kabbalism is sort of a path to reunion with God, and it talks about it offers a cosmology about how God created space within itself, and within that space there were these vessels that could hold its light and trickle down into creation. And we have, as human beings, some of God's light trapped within us. And our job is to basically take the path back to God and, potentially while we're alive, take the path back and transform our consciousness, into union with all of that is, I guess. So apologies if that's a cringy explanation of Kabbalah, and there's a lot of folks out there that might really not appreciate me bastardizing it. I don't know, maybe I got it right, but I guess find out for yourself. I'm in no way affiliated with this class, but I think it would be worthwhile for people, and I'm considering taking it. Dr. Yosef Rosen is offering a course on Sundays starting January 7th on Zoom, 7 o'clock Eastern, How to Become a Kabbalist, an introduction to Jewish mysticism and magic. So if you are interested in any of these other alternative schools of thought that intersect with Christianity, like Kabbalism, there's a lot of resources out there. Go check them out. And, if you catch this in time, go check out Dr. Rosen's course. Maybe I'll see you in there.
But, here you have this character, Job, right? Who,
yes.
Yeah, no, but it's good. And so
sorry, I totally derailed you, but yeah.
No, yeah, you did derail me. It's all good. It's all good. It's all connected, man.
Yeah.
But yeah, so you have this Job character, right? And he loses everything, and his friends are telling him, they're giving him responses, actually biblical responses from other parts of the Bible. They're saying, you've sinned clearly, and God's punishing you, or you've done this, and or this is the reason for it. And you get the kind of responses from Deuteronomy, you get the responses from Leviticus, perhaps, and finally, there's no answer that actually solves it, right? In the end, it's he gets spoken to by the whirlwind. I'm not happy with if you'd ask me, like, am I happy, satisfied with the ending of Job? Well, no, because the ending of Job is, shut up. You're not going to understand anything.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, well, I followed you all the way up to like talking to the whirlwind and like, being spoken to out of the whirlwind, but I'm waiting for the answer because it's a human thing to do, right? To like want to know, like, okay, now what, right? Like,
Sure.
something's just happened, and and there is a sense in which it's also very humbling to know that the Bible itself says you're not going to understand the answer, right? These are all temporary answers. And in some ways, you could take the response from the whirlwind in Job to basically be saying all of the biblical answers are contextual and temporary and time bound, and so forth. I mean, this is the struggle of early Christians, right? They had this word of God, and that was static, and they thought they knew what was who was in the community of God and who wasn't, and they were following Jewish dietary laws, and they certainly didn't believe that Gentiles could become part of the messianic people of God, and sure enough, the Peter's vision in Acts is all about, like, these impurities, these foods that have come down, the in Joppa, the lowering of the feast is full of all this food that Jews couldn't eat, and Peter's commanded to eat food, and he says, well, it's all unclean, and the voice says, essentially God says, well, don't declare unclean things that I've declared clean. And then the question becomes, well, if that's actually if that's a biblical story, right? In that particular context, it does refer to, bringing Gentiles in who eat impure food into the community of God. But then the question is, and I remember, the first time I heard this from one of my professors, Luke Timothy Johnson, who was like, but what does it mean now? Like, nobody in the Christian communities, they're all primarily, for the most part, Gentile communities. So what does it these texts just dead? Does it still have meaning? And that's the question, right? Is there an ongoing? That's actually the constitutional question. Is there an ongoing meaning? And what is the original meaning, right? Originalist interpretation of the Bible is it just applies to food. Or if you're somebody who's extending the meaning, you're saying, well, yeah, but it's also a question. It does raise the question about who's an outsider and who's an insider. And then the question can be extended, as Johnson pointed out, to gays and lesbians, for instance, in bringing them into the Christian community, because they're being considered, quote unquote, impure, right, by certain standards of Christianity. But who are, but the whole point is God's working among them, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a really interesting, when you start doing that, right? You can see immediately you can see the correlation between the Constitution and the Bible there, right? That depends on how and people are like, and you'll get the originalists like, no, it just applies to, right, the original intent. But then it's a fair question, like, to me, and that was always the question that got me going, was like, well, because I came from that tradition, right? Just the original intent. And I'm like, well, yeah. But then it's kind of a dead book, right? I mean, it was great, right? I mean, it's not dead in the sense that it gives me my founding story, I suppose, but I want more than that in life. I want a text that doesn't just send me inward to become kind of a pious Christian. I want something that kind of is a way to kind of relate to the world around me, and it's a complicated world. And honestly, I mean, yeah, sure, our world's complicated, but early Christians' worlds were complicated too, and the worlds of ancient Jews were complicated, it's I mean, it might have less people, but not in some ways not. I mean, depending on where you lived, you could be in a huge metropolis with all kinds of difference around you, different, and having to negotiate difference. And the Bible is I think a really profound book for helping us negotiate difference. It's not an easy book. Paul's letters. I mean, Paul's the primary apostle that we lift up from the early Christian tradition, right? And his letters are filled with with like temps. I mean, all of them are all attempting to negotiate like conflicts, both in the community, right, between individuals, and between the community and kind of its contextual sphere, and having to relate to the authorities, and having to relate to the Greek overlords or the Roman overlords, having to relate to Jews who are living nearby them, having to relate to just people in the marketplace. How do you negotiate slaves in the household, right? And what do you do when slaves become converted and they now want to participate in the assembly? Well, how does the hierarchies of that apply on the outside in your household in the quote unquote real world now apply within the spiritual household? All of these huge complications, and you know you the Jewish tradition is and I think shows much more starkly the impact of war and terror, trauma. I mean, one thing that we don't really focus on a lot is just how much warfare, how much threat there was either from external forces or from natural forces, starvation, fires, floods. I mean, the flood story in Noah's Ark, a universal flood story, right?
Okay, so it really blew my noodle back when I first discovered that the flood myth was universal. I thought the story of Noah's Ark was very specific to Christianity and my Catholic upbringing, but soon found out that the story goes way back further in time. Enlil, the god of the Epic of Gilgamesh, wipes out humanity with a flood. Zeus has plans to take out humanity with a flood. Same within Hindu mythology, there's a flood myth. So this idea of a great global cataclysm is across a ton of different cultures and time periods. And then, interesting to note, those of you who are fans of Graham Hancock, the gentleman who posits basically that, there's evidence of much older civilizations, or at least that our timeline for people and civilization is a little bit off. He talks often about this Younger Dryas event, which is potentially an asteroid hitting the glacial melt, which is in present-day North America, could have caused this global flood. I'm certainly not well-versed enough in it to speak definitively anyway, but it's an interesting topic that I'm sure plenty of other people would find interesting or want to explore. But outside of the other flood myths, I did want to point out that the other day I watched the Christopher Nolan movie Interstellar, and to me that has a lot of not flood myth necessarily parallels, but sort of a Noah's Ark type of scenario where humanity is trying to be saved. Interestingly enough, kind of ties into what Dr. Penner pointed out earlier, where science has taken this role of saving humanity versus I guess spirituality or a religious perspective. But at any rate, there's two ideas at play in Interstellar, and I won't spoil the movie, but Earth's dying basically because of human activity. A new planet needs to be found. There's not necessarily hope that we can even get people there, so some people are sent off to take the seeds of life, the DNA, to seed a planet with the chemistry for life. And then there's hope that a starship could also take some survivors to a new planet. But I won't spoil it and tell you how it ends or how that plays out. But this idea of bringing the seeds of a life, the DNA, to a planet to seed it, it's not a new idea. And actually, somebody that you might be familiar with, Sir Francis Crick, the gentleman who discovered the DNA double helix structure, won a Nobel Prize for it. After he was done with that work, he moved on to studying panspermia, the idea that the molecules or the building blocks or the ingredients for life came to Earth via an asteroid impact or a comet impact, and almost like a sperm coming to an egg and bringing the genetic material for life to start to blossom. And he even explored the idea of directed panspermia, where, much like Interstellar, maybe a similar civilization to us in a distant place squandered the resources and opportunity of a life-bearing planet and sent out their DNA, and eventually maybe it landed here and populated the earth, and evolution took place, and we are their ancestors in a sense. Pretty trippy, far out there thought, not certainly grounded in an abundance of research, but cool ideas to explore nonetheless. And the places you'll go when you explore the myths of Noah's Ark, the other flood myths, and if you watch the movie Interstellar. Okay, back to the podcast.
As a reminder that for many people, the threat of floods was, there was no, once your food source was gone, there was no external, there was no FEMA coming in, right? That's it. I mean, I grew up in a flood zone as a kid, and I remember how nervous everyone got come spring, right? And this was in Canada, in southern Manitoba. Here, living in the South, I think of the hurricanes and tornadoes and the constant presence on Florida, constant presence of FEMA, right? But we have an infrastructure now that's in existence for us that will probably preclude anyone from, not a lot of people from starving in a way that in the ancient world, once your food supply was gone, that was it. And and then a fire, and when you don't have the ability to put out fires in the same way that we do, and we know the damage that a fire can do here. So anyways, I mean, the forest fires, I mean, you think of the forest fires in California, for instance, right, or Colorado, when these happen, it's or what we saw in Hawaii, right? Yeah. So it's a world where people are, these texts had a lot of meaning in those contexts. And I'm struck constantly also by the biblical, whether they ever did it or not, the fact that it's written into the law of every, the year of Jubilee, of ensuring that nobody ever accumulated too much wealth, and they would flip it back to the people, and there was a constant kind of recycling, right? So the idea of and it's actually kind of interesting because they take the idea of the fallow ground, like farm gardening metaphor, right? You farm it, if you've used a particular piece of land for a while, you need to let it rest, move to another portion, right, and let that kind of regenerate. They have laws about that in the ancient world, in the Jewish tradition, ancient Israelite tradition, but they also then apply that fallowing, if you will, that metaphor, because they're like, well, if that's what the ground needs, and that's also what communities need, right? And this idea that after a time, because they understood, that's the fascinating thing, they understood already back then that people were always going to want to accumulate more. It's a very natural thing. It's an evolutionary impulse. And at the end of the day, that comes from us being, animals, or perhaps more than that, with our ability to have ever evolved concepts of language, and has allowed us to kind of expand that, to think that we're more than animals. That was always entertaining to Nietzsche, his idea that human beings are the only species of animals that thinks they're more than animals, but they're all the more fascinating for thinking that. It's actually true.
Well, I heard you talk about love, the word love, and interpreting signs in society, and then using Nietzsche, kind of laughing at people for thinking that love was real, and that
Right.
like we're not just animals
Right.
creating our own meaning.
Right. Right. I mentioned that at some point, did I?
Well, maybe
Yeah.
I
Yeah. It
think there was
sounds like,
a talk at
yeah.
PRS, I think, many years
Right.
ago.
Right. Yes.
Okay, so two things here. First, I will put the link to the lecture we're talking about in the description, so you can go check that out if you like. The other thing is this place we're talking about, PRS. It's the Philosophical Research Society in Los Feliz, or Los Angeles, California. It was started by this gentleman named Manly Palmer Hall. It was intended to serve as the modern Library of Alexandria, if you will, a place for wisdom from antiquity to modern day to come live on these bookshelves and be accessible to the public. PRS is very much accomplished that and continues to be a living, breathing Library of Alexandria of sorts. It's also a place where you can go see lectures from various experts in fields related to wisdom seeking. So go check out PRS. It's a wonderful physical location, and it was started by a marvelous person, Manly Palmer Hall, who wrote a book which has been exceptionally important to the beginning of my seeking journey. The book is called The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it's an interpretation of the secret teachings concealed within the rituals, allegories, and mysteries of the ages. More specifically, it's an encyclopedic outline of Masonic, Hermetic, Kabbalistic, and Rosicrucian symbolical philosophy. So go check this book out. It is vast. It talks about a number of subjects and can be a real tool to anyone seeking to know themselves better. I would recommend the Seekers edition put together by Mitch Horowitz. Mitch has done extensive work with Manly Hall's collection. He's a lecturer in residence at PRS and has done a great job making sure that this edition he put together makes the text really accessible to the modern seeker. So that's PRS, Manly Hall, The Secret Teachings. Go check all of it out, and I'll have links to it in the description.
Yeah. Well, that was, um, I mean, the the Nietzsche, I think, had a, for all his faults, had some good analytics of the human condition, and was had a healthy dose of skepticism about the kind of value pretensions that human beings have. Human beings are primarily selfish creatures, and a lot of what we need to do is create, in part, out of our own, in some sense, selfish ends, you might say, um, create kind of social contracts, the Rousseauian notion of a social contract, right? That it's in my interest that we all agree to such certain terms, uh,
Sure.
right? And that's not, and that, look, talking about all that kind of goes against our own sense of who we are. I mean, because everyone now believes that there's so much more. I love, and I'm selfless, and I self-sacrifice, and so on and so forth. But these, for Nietzsche, a lot of these concepts were um, uh, basically delusional. I mean, they're ways to convince ourselves that, and in some sense, self-justify our actually selfish behavior. Now, I got to be honest with you that there's part of that resonates with me because I'm a healthy skeptic of discourses. At the same time, I live in another world where I'm also don't want to just think of myself. I want to have a meaningful and lively existence. And I think, in some sense, it's a matter of having a foot in both worlds, if you will. One is I just taught a course on it was actually a course on thinking about human beings and their connections to chimpanzees, essentially. And what does it mean
Really?
for human violence? Yeah. Uh, and so I was reading a lot of with students, reading a lot of work on primate anthropologists looking at violence, and so the primate anthropologists are the ones studying primates but making the connections to kind of human behavior and thinking about violence in those contexts, and how much violence can we control, and are there controls, and are we innately violent individuals? And yet our language, of course, we never, outside of, I don't think if you'd ask anyone, of course they'd say yes, human beings are violent. I mean, just look at the world around us. But
Sure.
on our day-to-day basis, we're not conceptualizing ourselves as violent individuals, right? And
Mm.
so the question is are we suppressing that side of ourselves? How much is there? So and obviously a pressing question for our time.
It
Uh,
is.
and so yeah, and and it was a quite a journey, and it was, in some sense it's also depressing too, but it's also invigorating to say, okay, but it's there's that, but that's not all we are, right? And I
Mm.
think so. With me, with Nietzsche, I have that sort of sense of like, yes, love is a made up concept, but on the other hand, I'm like, yeah, but whatever it is that helps me build community is also a love building exercise, right? So
Yeah. There's
I understand my
value. There's
yeah,
value
exactly.
in meaning to all. Yeah.
Yeah,
I
exactly.
can
So I
I
can
can
see.
understand that, like, hey, even if I am making it up, like it's a
Yes,
good it's
that's right.
worth making up.
That's right, exactly. That's
Yeah.
right, exactly. That's exactly it. That's, I think, and for me, it's important to keep both. I think I think the danger is in this is to do one or the other, and to have the
Sure.
other disappear, right? To sort of become unskeptical about people's language and how they're using language, and because as if it's not even anchored in the realities of the world we live in, which was Nietzsche's concern. But then to lose sight of the importance of, like, we still have to. I mean, Nietzsche didn't build community. He was not noted. He was not a noted community builder.
Sure.
So so for people who are interested in something beyond themselves, right, in the kind of meaning making enterprise, it means that, okay, you're infusing language, then you're going to also give it meaning, and it's going to be given meaning through a kind of like action oriented response to the world around you. But you never lose sight of the fact that every act of meaning making is also an act of self delusion, and you kind of accept that. For me, that's, I mean, I'm not, that's a position that people have to come to, I think, in some sense on their own. But for me, that's a healthy perspective. Like, yeah, okay, I might be delusional, but today it feels good to be delusional like this, right? To have these kinds of relationships with people that are building up rather than tearing down. I think this is
Well, it
um,
reminds me of something I saw this morning. Actually, it was someone talking about, like, if you were. I think it was probably an old Alan Watts quote they were musing on. Like, if you were God in the sense that you were all that is, you'd probably be bored. So, like,
right,
create the universe, create all this, and you're giving it meaning because maybe
right,
you're bored or lonely, and like that,
right,
just creating and enjoying the creation is the meaning, and that's enough. Like, it doesn't have
right.
to be.
Right. Yeah. Well, this is why I've always thought process theology. I don't know how familiar you are with that. Alfred North Whitehead,
No, what's
John
that?
Cobb. This idea that God is also evolving in relationship to the creation that it
Mhm.
created, so that God is not static. It's one of the kind of fascinating uh, ideas that because we always think, well, in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God is static, right? That's the one unchangeable,
Sure.
and the Greek tradition as well. Um, the prime mover is the prime mover, but the um, in the process theology, it's this idea that it's not just that our conceptions of God are changing, right? That would be the kind of consciousness evolution. We're getting a greater consciousness of who and what God is. But actually, God itself changes in relationship to both the earth and its inhabitants, as so there's a kind of dialectical relationship of evolutionary growth, which was the contribution. There's not there is still some process theologians around, but they're not as frequent as they were, let's say 40 years ago. It's a long time ago, but I think there's some really kind of interesting traditions to explore in terms of thinking about the world. I mean, I am committed, and one of the things we live right now in a time period where science kind of has a kind of dominating
big time.
and in some ways, and that's fine. I mean, lots to be thankful for scientific innovation and change, but I'm always amazed at the limitations, and not just in terms of its kind of conceptions, but also in terms of practitioners. Sometimes in terms of the limitations they have on willing to kind of think about the problems that humans have, physical, social, psychological, in a kind of broader framework. And I often use the example. It's one of my favorite examples of Genesis, the creation of the world in Genesis, and where God creates the world, and God speaks, and from God everything flows, and beyond that, and I guess in some sense this is because I was a kid, a little OCD as a kid. I got fixated. I always assumed that everyone did this. Probably they didn't. But I was always fixated because I was always told God was eternal, right? So eternality, right? You can conceptualize as a human being, like if I said to you, Ron, you're going to live forever, right? You have a conception of what that means, because you can go mentally, you can go forward from a point in time eternally. You can just imagine what that's like. Is you not get tired. You're like, wow, that's never going to die. It's going to live forever, right? But it's like there's not a change for you in terms of your like current status. Like you can, like, time space continuum doesn't fundamentally change in that respect. But if I say to you, God not only exists from here to eternity, but also existed eternally before that, had no origin. See, that's the thing that as a kid I was like, and I'd sit there and I'd go like, okay, I'm gonna try and imagine that, like what's it like, and it would like kind of like freak me out. I would be like, I can't get my head around that. Like, how does something
Kind of
eternally
paradox.
exist? Yeah, exactly. Because again, because I'm now having to think about and kind of invert the whole thing on its head. How does something not actually have an origin? I can understand how something doesn't have an end, but it still has an origin. I don't understand. So that's a kind of conceptual category of thinking. It has to do with certain kinds of modern notions of time and space, right? That part of our kind of Kantian consciousness structures that we perceive the world as this way. But all of that's to say that in the biblical tradition, right, it is a tradition that doesn't focus on what came before. It simply focuses on a point of origin, which is exactly ultimately what science does with the Big Bang, which is where this was all going. Is that the Big Bang itself, right, is a story. I'm going to call it a myth. It's a story, like the Genesis story, where we've postulated a way to understand, with not to say there's not some evidence, right, for how the matter originates, and it originates from for lack of a better linguistic category, a Big Bang, boom, matter came into existence, right? But that's the point of origin, right? So if that's from the moment from which everything proceeds, this is how I would put it. The Big Bang is the moment from which everything proceeds, beyond which nothing can be said. We have no ability, conceptually, scientifically, or otherwise, to talk about what came before the Big Bang, right? But we know that the something that produces the Big Bang can't just like just happen. Like it
Right.
can't be like
Right.
nothing and then something, right? I mean, we at least we can't fathom that. But how
So
that
can I
happens,
ask you a question that I think is kind of related?
right?
I've recalled you talk about, well, maybe not entirely related, but I've heard you talk about the concept of Christ as like law, and maybe that's
Right.
the first thing that comes from that beyond, so to speak, that unknowable beyond, or God, original
Right.
source. Wondering, like, how does that tie into this? How does the concept
Right.
of Christ relate to that?
That sounds like it goes back to that UPR lecture I
It
delivered.
does, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Oh man, that was a I'd have to go back and there was a whole argument I was unraveling in that
You talked
uh
about like the concept of Christ versus Jesus Christ, like the universality
right.
of law versus like Jesus Christ, the person, and then like there was a merging of the two
Right.
at some
Right.
point.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good kind of like consciousness lecture.
Yeah,
Um,
oh, it
so
was very
this
helpful.
idea, right, that I mean, one of the things to think about in terms of political theology really is this, law enters the world, right? We have the Jewish tradition of the law entering the world, but we also have a kind of manifestation of law. I mean, so societies essentially function right through order, right? Essentially, all societies are creating order out of chaos, right? They're all
Yeah,
mimicking the origin of the world every time they set themselves up. It's not by accident that we have biblical laws for God's people because that's how societies work. They need to have a kind of social contract to work. Frequently, those laws favor the king, right? The absolute
right.
power,
Yeah,
which essentially explains our kind of concepts of the origin of God, right? Well, if there's a king here, somebody who's in power, then clearly there must also be someone who like oversees everything, right? And then is it just a god over this land, or is it a god over all the world, all the universe, cosmos, whatever? Um, in the Christian tradition, right, you see that struggle between, and I think that's what I was working out in that lecture. I, that was like 2018. So what was that? 6 years ago.
sure.
Uh, uh, and I think at that, what I'm when I think about uh, those that I guess that lecture now, one of the things I was trying to negotiate was this the biblical tradition's tension between the humanity and the law, and how how do we and I guess that is in some sense growing up a fundamentalist. That is, I recognize the importance of structure and uh, you know why do we stop at red stoplights? Well, it's arbitrary in some sense. It's an arbitrary request, but it's a useful request, right? Why do we wear seatbelts? Because, well, I just, because you have an accident, you get thrown from your car, you're more likely to die, right? It's awful. And so, but these are all arbitrary concessions, but we do them for a reason. We do them because they help make life easier. And you could say, well, it's my right not to wear a seatbelt. And I'm like, well, yeah, but then if you get hurt, somebody has to pay the medical bill, and we want to do that, right? So there is a kind of communal responsibility that we have that laws create. At the same time, there's the freedom of the individual. And that is a very American concept. That is probably the most Christian. So if I think of like what's the most Christian element of this nation, it's the end of Braveheart with Mel Gibson, because Mel Gibson, despite being was the Australian, he essentially represents in my mind all those films, The Patriot, Braveheart, even the Lethal Weapon films. They all represent something very distinctively American about his character. But the end of Braveheart, right? He's being drawn and quartered, and his last words are freedom, right? And it's just this amazing rallying cry, right, of freedom and the Patriot same thing, right? Where he's actually there reenacting the Revolutionary War, and he's, and again, a character who, I mean, it's very important in the American imagination to have martyrs, right? People who are willing to sacrifice themselves and for freedom, and that comes from the biblical tradition. That's the very deeply rooted biblical concept: the freedom of the individual, the community being free. Right. These are not just Republican ideals. The Republican ideals come from a deep sense of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And in some sense, what the Americans took was moving away from the more community-centered freedom of the Jewish tradition, let's say, and a more like, and I don't mean this in a negative way, self-centered, but a kind of centering of the self freedom in the American tradition, which is the individual is free. And this is a really, and I think there's the question for me is always like, that's good, but there's also law. And I think there's a sense in which you could say the mythic concepts of Jesus Christ and Christ as a law, as a kind of force of God's power in the world that structures the world both through creation, right? Structure the world's created through Christ, let's say, in terms of that, and provides a kind of blueprint, right? Which is a wisdom blueprint, which is connected with law and wisdom in the Jewish tradition. So that wisdom blueprint helps structure and organize the world in a particular way so that it works at least relatively well on a natural level, right? And then communities, in some sense, the Stoic idea of mimicking nature, right? Christians adopted that too. This idea of was always found it really compelling to think about the faith of Christ being faithful like Christ, mimicking Christ, imitating Christ, the imitatio Christi of the Catholic tradition. But that was actually what many the earliest Christian interpreters seem to have been more in line with that idea, right? We've turned it into kind of propositional. I have to believe in Jesus as like my Lord and Savior, but there's a much more kind of enriching, kind of mimicking of imitating of Jesus in the tradition. And what does it mean to be this kind of individual, right? Yeah. And still negotiate law. It's one of the toughest things. I mean, somebody who, I'm a Gemini, so and I've always been a free spirit. So it's always a tough thing is there's certain laws that you obey that you're like, I don't see the point in this, but you consent to doing it because it's like part of what you do. And but also there's a lot of reasons to do things, right, that we don't necessarily want to do. When I walk around the neighborhood just today, there's 4 dog dumps that aren't picked up. And I'm like, why don't people just see they have some responsibility to the community? And I'm like, fix it. I don't care where it's at. It can be in the middle of like some forest somewhere. But if my dog dumps, I pick it up because that's what you do. Right. I mean, and
we have people that bag it and then leave the bag. And I'm like, wow, yeah. That's even worse because now you got the plastic and the dump.
Exactly. That's right. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. But it is a very human thing to do, and I think it's something we need to. I think a conscious Christian is somebody, if you want to think through the Christian tradition, and I've a long. I could have been born in any. David Tracy talks about he could have been born a Buddhist, and then he would be doing Buddhist theology, but he wasn't born a Buddhist. He was born a Catholic, and he became a Jesuit scholar, and so this is what he does, and that's always made sense to me. Like, yeah, I was born in this tradition. I think through these traditions, right? But one of the things you want to do is think through your traditions in a way that's expansive, right? That both acknowledges the importance of structure and different structures at different points of our lives, right? For different reasons. And then also to understand that all structure is also an illusion, right? Yeah. To live in both worlds. And maybe that is what I was trying to negotiate in that lecture is what is it like to live in these two worlds using Jesus and Christ as a kind of way to negotiate that.
Yeah. And you pointed something else out in that lecture I thought was meaningful. That was the idea of like, oh, if you, I think you, I forget who you were quoting, but it was like, if you only speak one language, you speak none. Like,
Right.
sure, stay in
Right.
here, like, uh, the worldview you grew up in, but go find out
Right.
about others, and then you
Right.
that helps you look back at
Right.
your worldview and
Right.
understand the edges and boundaries of it.
Right.
And it's
Yeah, it
plays.
comes from that's a great, I'm glad you brought that up. It's a great concept in religious studies. We use it a lot. So the initial concept comes from Goethe. A person who knows one language knows none. And anybody who's learned multiple languages will immediately relate to that, right? Is that he's not saying that you don't know your own language, but you
Right.
don't know your language until you. Right? I studied. I can't tell you how many years I spent studying English grammar, but it was when I studied um, Greek and Latin, and I had to construct phrases in German, particularly when I started doing German translating backwards and forwards from going from English to German, and also from German having to translate German to English, but then also having to translate English Ernest Hemingway Ernest Hemingway into German one of my exams, and I was like, you learn, you have to think about your language and how meaning is constructed, and then be able to relate that in another language, which means you have to really understand what a direct and indirect object are. Most people know intuitively if you can speak English, you're using direct and indirect objects, but you don't fully know how it all works until you've had to learn multiple languages. And so, Friedrich Max Mueller took that expression and applied it to religion. Is the person who knows one religion knows none, and by that he didn't mean that you don't know your own religion. He just meant that what you don't fully understand, right, the complexity of how meaning is formed within a particular, what we might call a structure of meaning making in a religious tradition until you've been able to do a kind of comparative study, right? So, one of the William Cantwell Smith, I think the best example and the most, I think it's one that everyone gets right away is that, if you'd ask a lot of people, like, what if you have Jesus in the Christian tradition, what would be the nearest comparison in the Muslim tradition? Everyone's going to say, well, Muhammad, right? Because Muhammad is a person, right? So it depends on what you do the comparison on, right? Person, flesh and blood. Jesus, person, flesh and blood. They were both prophet-like characters. They both were the founders of the movement, right? And William Campbell would say that would be the wrong answer, right? He says actually, functionally, in terms of the kind of function of the religions, if you studied Islam and you studied Christianity, you'd understand that the comparison on the one hand is a surface level. You can see why people would make that comparison, but it's actually the proper comparison of the relationship of Jesus and Christianity is the Quran in Islam. So Jesus
Hmm.
is to the Quran because Jesus is God's word. If you actually look at the biblical text and the earliest traditions about Jesus, Jesus is God's word. Jesus is unchanging. That is what the Quran is and the kind of nature and the function of Jesus in Christianity is similar to the Quran in Islam. And I would then say similar then to the community in Judaism. If I think of the three sort of Abrahamic faiths, I think of that's the triad, if you will, the Quran, the community, and Jesus. All of them function within their traditions, respective traditions, in a very similar way. And that helps you really understand a lot more about why it is that, Muslims get really upset when you, like, threaten to do something to the Quran, just like they get really upset when you Christians get really upset when you like, disrespect Jesus and, like in these artistic representations, and you really want to like get at Christians, do something like really kind of gross with a cross and urine or something, and put that on display in an art gallery, and you'll have people picketing like, how could you do this, right? And you can also then understand why the community, any kind of fraction of the Jewish community, is met with such a response worldwide. So it is really helpful then to think about that religion and that concept, right? It means that the more you know, right, the more you know about anything, the more you can relativize also your own position. Like, this is a thing I talk about with students a lot. It's hard for them. They're young. I work with a lot of Gen Z students. They crave it. They do want to see a world beyond where they're at right now, and to help people in a non-threatening way confront views of the world that are different than theirs, right? Without closing them down. It's tough. It's tough because our first reaction is to like, it's the dog park reaction. I call it the dog park reaction, where like you go to the dog park, it's like the dogs are like, okay, this is what. Oh, excuse me, I got my foot caught on it. The dogs are like, this is what we're all gonna do this now. We're watching dogs at the dog park. It's like,
yeah,
yeah.
absolutely.
Oh, okay. We're gonna do this now. Okay.
The group
Or,
think it's
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
unbelievable.
yeah. It's you can see it, and it's the dog park phenomenon. And if a dog's out of line, I think there's a hierarchy there and everything. There's like a, alpha dog, and there's a lot of beta dogs following around. And if the dogs are like, we're now gonna go greet the owners, like, okay, it's time to greet the owners. Oh, that's what we're doing, right? And I have a neurodivergent dog, so he never really understood all the dog park rules. That he doesn't go to the dog park anymore for that reason, because there's just always too much drama.
Yeah,
But
I feel better about my dog now too. It's like, all right, we're in the same boat. Like my dog didn't jump on the scene. Maybe that's good. Maybe people really are like their owners, and hopefully
right.
we're
No,
not
I think.
emulating the
Oh, I
dog
think there's
park mindset.
I think there's this kind of symbiotic. You're drawn to certain. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, there's the connection there. But yeah, and I think that we see that in our culture a lot, right? People are kind of like, you have to do the same thing. It's what we would call I would call it a cultural high conflict kind of approach, that and it's produced in some sense by as this kind of um, a period of capitalism we live in, where it's this kind of high finance capitalism, and it's a way. It's kind of Hartmut Rosa talks about the uncontrollability of the world. We live in a world that's fundamentally. He's a German sociologist, and he's despite all of the illusions and pretensions, it's an uncontrollable world, and we constantly seek to manage that. And we have a kind of hysteria, kind of low level, or maybe not always low level anxiety, kind of collective unconscious anxiety that is like a huge, massive dog park, and everyone's trying to manage it. I mean, and you can feel it. You can feel it when you're outside. You can feel it when you're at the mall, and it's something that is. I mean, ultimately, it's what's affecting life expectancy in our culture, right? That it's not individuals ultimately. It is an energy. It's an energy field that's being put out there. So you yourself can get your act together, right? You can move yourself to the mountains, right? And you can kind of like create a self, but the energy field is still there. And when you have to descend the mountain and go into town, right, you can feel it immediately, the energy.
Oh, there's no escaping it, right?
Right. Well, and the internet brings it, right? The TV and internet brings it to our doors as frequently as possible. But
Sure does.
Yeah.
So I'll try and just ask these real quick, and you don't have to spend a ton of time on them. But the questions I wanted to ask you are, can you summarize the Council of Nicaea, and like, was that really the purpose of that? Really to unify the kingdom, or to put together the best version of a holy text, or maybe both? And then my second question, I guess that was a two-part question, but the second one is, how much of the Bible really has like direct quotes and sayings from Jesus? Because I don't even know, like off the top of my head, and I've at least read the Bible a couple times and taken a few classes on it. So I don't think many people really know, even if they go to church all the time. So I can re-ask that, but those are the two big ones,
Okay.
burning ones.
Okay. So the Council of Nicaea. Well, I'd have to go back and refresh. Refresh. So the councils. There's numerous councils throughout the early church period, and in some sense, it's any kind of body organization is going to have rules and regulations, right? Beliefs. These are what guide us. These are how we think about who we are. Um, you know, Nicaea. I'm trying to think which one. There's Chalcedon. There's Nicaea. There's um,
I
the
guess
one.
any of them too, because I'm just
Right.
like to
So
give.
what their debate. There's a couple of there's very specific. They've got a slate of things. They got like here. It's like a Supreme Court. Essentially, it's like a Supreme Court, right? When they meet to talk about a case, this is what they're doing. Maybe that's a good metaphor to analogy to think about it. And
Yeah.
they meet. They have an agenda. They have various issues of the time. Usually, there's a heretic or two or three or four that has a position. People on the council hold what can be considered to be heretical views. Um, and they meet and they negotiate things like what's what scripture should be included in the text and what shouldn't. That's one of the things that you alluded to that.
Yeah.
The what gets counted in, what gets counted out. The Jewish tradition, the rabbis did the same thing. They had the councils where they met to decide what should be included and what shouldn't be included. Um, and Islam had similar kinds of had discussions, right?
Everybody's has it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yes. In some sense, the traditions that have more closed systems of scriptural, that are scripture heavy, like Judaism, the Abrahamic traditions, it's much more important to know what's in and what's out, right? Who belongs and who doesn't.
Asking a question about councils and Council of Nicaea was important to me because there's this idea of, people deciding what makes the cut and what doesn't, and what counts and what doesn't. And it's important to, at least know that has taken place in a sense, right? Like there's other gospels out there that suggest that you don't need the church or the clergy to guide you to God, and you can, find that by going inside yourself, or there's more emphasis on that. And, maybe those weren't included because that's threatening to a bureaucracy, such as the church. So, not to say that, all these councils had nefarious meetings and they were, about figuring out what books to include that made it easier to control the population. It's not really what I'm getting at, but just to know that these things existed and that there were iterations of the book even, or in the religion itself, is good to keep in mind. And, one example of that for, not things that were excluded, but, to just show a meaningful text that aren't a part of the Bible. There's a discovery of what were called the Dead Sea Scrolls in, modern day Middle East, where, Jesus was said to live. The texts were written in language contemporary with Jesus at the time, and they offer different perspectives than, what exists in the King James Bible or the current edition of the New Testament. So, an Old Testament rather. Councils are important. Decisions are made for various reasons by various players. What should be included in the texts of the Bible, and that's just important to keep in mind.
And what you find essentially is it's no surprise, and not in some sense a surprise in terms of our Supreme Court, and that is that the kind of spirit of the times dictates a lot of how things move. And sometimes people are taken up with the spirit of the times and they move things in a particular direction. Other times they react to the spirit of the times and they're like, we don't want all this change. We want to cut it down. We want to There's power struggles, right, in the church, just like there's power struggles in our politics, and people are using the sacred text to negotiate those power struggles, right? Our government has a lot of money that comes from big corporate interests, not by accident. Therefore, that also, right, just like it's not by accident that in early Christian councils, right, the interests of the quote unquote state were also, in play, right? What scriptures are included, right, are necessary. A stable scripture is necessary for a stable state. Another way to think about it, just like a stable interpretation of the Constitution is necessary for a stable state. There's a kind of organic relationship between anthropologically between the structure of the body of the text and the structure of the body of the state, right? And if you have a kind of text that's fluid, right, and kind of amorphous, right, then the state also is going to be created as a kind of unstable, amorphous character. So it's one, and the same thing goes for the body for Christ, God, right? Concepts, fundamental concepts that were deemed, essential to the Christian belief system. People were like, okay, there's like God, there's Christ, there's the Holy Spirit. How are they related? First of all, how is Christ? What is Christ? Is Christ God, or is he God man? And what does that mean? And how, essentially, the actual, determinations of these councils. Most Christians are heretics by their own. I always point that out to people that if you'd ask people to describe the Trinity, for instance, they would all be, essentially deemed heretical by the councils, even though they don't see themselves that way. They think, no, I believe in it. Well, they're just like, well, I believe whatever they believe. Right.
Yeah,
but if you actually try and describe it, they're using they're all philosophically trained. They're basically trained in Greek philosophy. They're using Greek philosophical concepts to describe complex processes of interrelated ontology, and that don't really make sense in terms of our kind of modern views of the world in some sense, right? So
no, difficult to grasp from that perspective for sure.
Yeah. So, all of that's to say, though, to your point, that these meetings that they had were really important because people do want to stabilize, right? As a tradition grows, it needs to stabilize it, right? We need to create these structures, the law, right? And now there's debates, and on those committees they would constantly debate. And one of the things I like to point out is that Athanasius, who's I believe it was Athanasius, who's one of the champions, one of the people who was formative in coming up with the final kind of canon of the early Christian scriptures, at least. He was at various points in time, depending on the council, I think it was like 28 times, in and out as a heretic and a non-heretic in the course of his life. So depending on the council and who won the day, right, he was either a heretic, going home like kind of your tail between your legs, I didn't win that one, or you go back the next year and you're like, oh, I won, now I'm no longer, right? So these are floating categories, right? Just like we see, what we see in the kind of tradition of constitutional interpretation in the states and laws, right? That they're morphing, they're changing, right? And one moment you're out, the next moment you're in. And it's the same kind of struggle, but it's the same struggle. That's an important thing, I think, to make the connection, was that it's the same struggle that we see ongoing here, that these debates from the past actually are illustrative and helpful for us thinking about where we're at in the present. Then they're hopeful too, because you're like, if you find yourself on the out right now, you might well be on the in 5 years from now, right? At the next council, the next, right? It is about defining the structure of society, of any society, whether it's a religious group or it's a political group or social group, that you're constantly having to negotiate the essences of something and its applications, and closing down what counts and what doesn't count, right? Like, do you get to count, like, people, and people would know more about this than I do, but the but you talk about the Constitution and you talk about the Federalist paper, like the papers, right? The Federalist Papers, and like where do we go for the, to inform? Like these are the kinds of things that early Christians were debating too about their scriptures, like what counts, like where should we limit it, and what you limit, right, determines what you can apply, right? So these are human activities. I think that's the key here. Whatever is going on is a human activity. It's natural. And doesn't mean it's harmless, because because there's a lot at stake, and the people making the decisions frequently are stakeholders, and they're invested in the outcome. And so it's really fascinating to kind of see that play out. But yeah, that it doesn't tell you what the Council of Nicaea is, but it gives you some idea of what it did. As for the words of Jesus in the biblical text, yeah. So the Jesus Seminar is famous on the American scene for creating the kind of trying to discern what Jesus said, what he didn't say. This has been a long-standing kind of modern problem, right? And I got to be honest with you, my line to that is, and it's not going to be one that most people are going to agree with. So let me just say that at the outset. But Jesus did none of it, and he said all of it. I mean, in some ways, that's kind of I don't think at one level it's possible to say that Jesus said any of it. But on the other hand, in the narrative now, Jesus says it. I mean, how do you know? Well, it says it right now. Jesus just said it. And there's a certain kind of simplicity to that too. Like in the narrative, in the text, Jesus says it, right? And it's pretty cool. It's some pretty cool stuff. You could have like a whole, I was just looking at calendars for the coming year, and just thinking that'd actually be a great, now that I think about it, I should put out a calendar of like Jesus said this, every day, like, oh wow, Jesus said this, yeah, wow, that's really cool, right? 365 days of what Jesus said. And but it is a question. It's a very much a modern question, right? We understand that there's sources in the biblical text. We understand that the text makes claims to a kind of historical that the writers have historical proximity to this Jesus, that they're recording his words, and the writer of the Gospel of Luke makes a big opening statement about how these are actual traditions, and the interviews and eyewitnesses, right? The eyewitness accounts are very important. How much credence do you give that as a historian? Like so a little bit like the more you claim there's eyewitnesses, the more you're like, yeah, no, why are you the person protests too much. In some sense, there's like this idea that the more you say it, the more you're wondering, like, well, maybe it's because you don't have any eyewitnesses. It's, to me, it's always about like, well, I like to think of it though that it's the intact tradition that we have, and as a text, it works pretty well, and it's a good narrative, it's a good story. I mean, as far as stories go, it's a great story. I mean, if you grew up in the Christian tradition, you're like, it's not as good as some other stories. And I understand that, because you're kind of tired of the same old stories, right? But, you do a course. I did one last year on, the gospel. You can look at the Gospels alongside like the Gilgamesh epic, and look alongside the story of the origin of, coming out of Egypt, of the Jewish people, the Israelite people, and then the Popova, and the origin stories of Mesoamerica, and the apocalypse, and Pinocchio. Great new translation, the Penguin edition of Pinocchio. It's a great story. I love Pinocchio. And there really is a very, the journey into kind of like, the actual story of Pinocchio is not the one that we're used to, right? The Disney version growing up. But to see these stories, the Jesus story holds up pretty well. It's what we would call, what David Tracy would call a classic. I mean, it's a story that has informed our culture, those words have shaped people's lives over, and in this case has created, I would argue that that tradition created America, not in the way that people are like, we're Bible believers. I mean, the Bible, if everyone were Bible believers, this country would function very differently. But it does. There's a sense in which, right, that there's kind of richness from that tradition that gave some foundational principles to how people conceptualize themselves individually and collectively. So as story goes, it's pretty powerful, right? And who doesn't like the story of a martyr who saves others, and also one who resurrects in the end, right? Those are all fantastic, right? The return of the hero, and the hero's coming back, right? Those are all fantastic too. So all of that's to say that I like to think that none of it Jesus said and all of it. So not a very satisfying answer. People are like, that's a
No,
cop out, but
I don't think that's a cop out. I think that's as realistic as you can be, honestly. Like, yeah, like, of course, nobody can say with certainty that Dave was there and wrote everything down verbatim that Jesus said, and like,
right,
got
exactly,
the evidence
right.
here. Like, yeah, no, I like that. I actually do like that answer. Instead of thinking it's a cop out, I like that. I think it's all encompassing.
It's an honest answer in the sense that and also I don't know what's gained this attempt. I mean, to sort of, I mean, it is another Nicene Council. This attempt to kind of pull out the actual words of Jesus is a way to say these are the traditions that matter, right? The other stuff accrues later and that's secondary and has no power.
You have no power here, Gandalf the Grey.
Or shouldn't have power, right? These are the core, right? So it is like it's a constitution. What's the core of the Constitution, right? Well, here's the Constitution. Okay, well now we're gonna pick out the elements that are the true, right? So you're like getting it's kind of like a text within a text, or the gospel with what we call a gospel within the gospel, right? The one that really matters, right? So those are again like kind of like councils of Nicaea. They're ways of negotiating power struggles, cultural and social battles. Oftentimes these are people who want to if you're somebody who says, I mean, you're either somebody who says everything that's in the Bible Jesus said, right? And you're a fundamentalist if you think that literally, which is fine, but that's that tradition, right? Then there's somebody who's like, those are all later traditions, and there's a whole kind of narrative structure to how this is placed. All of that's true, I believe. So therefore, we have to get back to the core of what Jesus said. But then what you're doing is you're trying to draw. What are you going to draw out? You're going to draw out Albert Schweitzer in his famous book on historical Jesus ended it. He went through all these epochs of people, all these scholars studying, who the real Jesus was, and his final chapters on it's all like looking into a well, right? And you look down the well, and what do you see reflected back up at you? You see your own reflection, and that was his determination that before he went on to give his own interpretation of the Jesus, but everyone else had looked in the well, right? He looked away from the well, apparently. But everyone else looked in the well and saw their own reflection come back. And in some ways, that's going to be the way that we're all going to interpret texts. It is like that well, right? If we're going to try and find the words of Jesus and pull them out, we're always going to find the ones that most appeal to us, that are the least complicated for us in our arrangement. Just like in our interpretation of the Constitution, we're always going to look at, what are we going to find? We're going to find the Constitution that mirrors back to us, right? Our values, right? And so it is that. It's a very human thing. It is frustrating, right? I mean, it's a very, we're self-invested, and there's something beautiful about that too. Like we're kind of all in, but and look, we're gung ho about what we see. We're not indifferent to it. We're like, yes, that's it. But that's the human side of us, right? There's a beauty to that, and there's also and you can celebrate the beauty of that while at the same time still being wary of taking what is a beautiful process of discovering what's meaningful to you, and then holding that up as this also now has to be meaningful to you, the other.
Right.
That's the danger. Right. That's the thing that we constantly find in our culture right now. We find whether it's referring to the Bible, or it comes up in our cultural politics, right? It's about like what worked for me, what's meaningful and helpful for me, right? Is not may not be meaningful and helpful to you. I'm thinking of the song uh, oh, the Proclaimers, I think it is. They have a song called "The Light." It's about I can't even name the song now, but it has to do with this light that shines, and it's a religion. They're talking about religion, but also they're talking about the religious wars in Ireland. And the light that shines so bright for you and changed your life, that light makes me blind. Uh, so right, that to me has always been a really powerful song. That idea that something can shine so brightly for you and it changed your life, but it'll make somebody else blind because it's contingent upon a whole set of experiences. I mean, if someone like the noted neuroscientist, one of the most famous neuroscientists in America, was it Sapolsky, that everything that happens in our lives is predetermined essentially by virtue of all of kinds of factors, most of which we're never going to discern. So the whole idea for me of like thinking about life as predetermined is interesting, but also kind of unhelpful. But at some level, if you just take that idea that you got to where you're at by virtue of millions of choices that you made that were also made for you and also were necessitated by material context over which you had no control, right? All of that led to this moment, this Damascus Road moment, and that light changed your life, but then, right, it just made somebody else blind.
Yeah.
Because it opened you up because of because of your journey, right? Your journey that brought you to that point, right? But somebody else who doesn't share that journey is not necessarily going to, good for you, right? I'm glad that you found that helpful, and you can genuinely celebrate with someone, right? But that is it for everything. I mean, in some sense, living in a liberal democracy, right, is about trying to create maximum opportunity for people to find their own path forward without restricting their options, because whatever options we try and restrict are going to be based on our own kind of like our own paths, right? What have brought us to this point. And we have to be mindful that no matter how certain we are and how much we know about other people's paths and journeys, there's always so many other paths and journeys, right? Like, there's so many things I don't understand. Like I work with a lot of Gen Z students, I work with a lot of trans students. I don't understand everything. I mean, and I don't get necessarily a lot of the stuff that they talk about. There's times I'm like, okay, this doesn't, my sort of way that my mind is framed, it doesn't compute. But I have to understand that this is like for them, this is their journey. Like, and I don't have to understand that journey. It doesn't have to make sense to me. Right. That's the key, I think. It doesn't have to make sense to me for me to say, I've got to allow you to have this journey. I've got to allow what I can to sort of be supportive of something I don't even understand, and maybe be supportive of something I don't even like at my kind of core level. It kind of goes against certain, fundamental principles that I could have had at another point in my life. But you know what? It's always about wanting to empower people to be on their own journey. Right. And to keep us from trying to make our mirror, our reflection in the well, kind of the thing that everyone else has to, the dog park, right?
Yeah. Your reflection has to look like my reflection.
Exactly.
Kind of.
That's right. Well, and it has to do with fundamental human insecurities. That's an animal insecurity, right? You see it in the dog park, right? You're not doing it right because I don't know who I am unless you mirror back to me who I am. And we're living in a moment now where, for whatever reason, like when people talk about is the world a worse place than it was like when I was growing up? No, it's different, very different, but it's not, I wouldn't say it's worse. I don't think it's better, but it's not worse. But I do feel like when I was growing up, there was a lot less kind of collective need for mirroring that we have now in our culture. There's a kind of collective conscious desire for mirroring back from everyone, politically, on the political level, on the social level, in the educational level, right? Where before people understood that there was difference, now difference is threatening, to everyone. It doesn't matter who you are on the political
Yeah,
spectrum.
nuance doesn't exist anymore.
No, it doesn't. No, that's right. That's right. Right. No, and I think that's so important. That's so important, like to sort of get that, like that ultimately the more secure you are as a person, and that's really the desire of a kind of consciousness raising and building program is like your podcast is the more sort of self-secure you are, the less need you're going to have for this kind of mirroring. Like it's okay that you're different, and I don't need to understand all of the intricacies of why we're different. You just are, and we'll celebrate that. And in some ways, seeking out. And I always encourage young people to seek out people who are different. There's no point in having your whole life just affirmed for you. You really want to discover and meet people who don't agree with you or who live differently or who think differently, because it's through encountering that difference that you understand a lot more of who you are and you become more secure in who you are. And it's also helps you understand empathetically through kind of empathetic, what I call the empathetic imagination, your ability to kind of think about why people might have gone that path. It is like creative process. You never know for sure, but like interpreting history, right? Like interpreting the Bible, you can imagine worlds in which this made sense, and you can imagine a world in which that makes sense. And that's a helpful exercise because it creates bridges. People have way more in common in the end. I can tell you this, and you probably, I'm sure you won't disagree. We have way more in common than we have that divides us, but we always focus on our differences and divisions, right? I mean, that's what we focus on.
Such a tragedy.
It is. Yeah, and no, but by the end of the day, you're like, oh my goodness, it's like we have nothing but division between us, and yet that's actually not true. And you guys think of this at the family levels, right? People go to their family gatherings, sitting around. You have tremendous history, right? And maybe not all of it great, but you have a lot in common, right? You have stories in common, traditions in common, food in common, rituals in common, right?
Yes.
And the commonalities, if you're just sort of talk about the basic commonalities, you're like, wow, I guess that's true. We all have this in common, but we tend to, or people can get caught up in, on what divides, on the differences, because of our insecurities, right? Because of our hurts and pains from the past, right? Unresolved issues. This is why, right? Physician, heal thyself is the first order of business.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah.
Heal and know thyself, right? Really
exactly.
are the
right.
ultimate starting points.
That's right. Well, listen, this has been a joy. I gotta say, I really appreciate you taking the time, and I think it's a wonderful thing you're doing, Ryan. And I've always been impressed with, your ability to kind of like just kind of step out and, like, I mean, look, you have a job and you've got a life, and you could just easily, go and do your own thing, right? But you're interested in like you're interested in studying and growing, and that's such a beautiful thing, man. I mean, that's just great. That is great.
No, I appreciate it. Honestly, it's through connections like this and people who are just willing to share the knowledge, and I'm excited because I know that there might be one person that watches this. Hopefully, there's a lot more, but I think that like this, when I talk to my friends who aren't as into this stuff every day, I always get an ear at some point when I'm talking to them about something new like this. And I hope that that's what this can be, whether it's this conversation or the others. So yeah,
well, and it is
for
like
supporting it and contributing to it, because it's super meaningful to me, but I suspect it'll be meaningful to other people as well.
Well, I think a lot of this is, and I view this, for myself in the same way that coming on and meeting with you. I mean, first of all, it's you and me talking. Other people get to, be in on this, but also it's, it is about the process, right? I mean, I've been thinking and learning as I've been talking to you, and you're processing yourself as a human being. You're evolving as a human being, as we're talking. And in some sense, to me, that's the great, notion behind this idea of anything that we do in life is ultimately, there's the end product, and how many people are going to listen or hear, and how many of them are going to have ears to hear, or who have actually heard, right? Who are going to hear the real core, right? There's always that, but there's also that, this idea of that it's like the Tibetan Buddhist mandala. Is it this idea of like these fine grains of sand that you put on this, elaborate creation that you make, and then at the end of it you blow it all away, right? Symbolizing the impermanence of the universe, creation and destruction. But it's also who you've become in the process. You became somebody who did that. You built that. You made that beautiful van, right? That could do those things. That's amazing. Yeah.
Stays. Yeah.
Well, listen, all the best. I wish you and your wife and your continued journey, and I hope that we get to meet again. So, don't stay a stranger.
Likewise. Stay well with everything across the board. My sincere gratitude. It really is an honor to reconnect and have you here. But I'll certainly let you know when this is edited and up, and so you can see it. And just thanks again for not just this, but just everything in general. I really mean it. You help my seeking journey tremendously, and I hold you in very high regard for that.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Ron. That means a lot.
Yeah. All right, Dr. Penner. You take care. Have a good night.
That is it for another edition of Paradigm Sherpas. Thanks for tuning in, checking out what Dr. Penner had to say about the biblical tradition, myth, how we make meaning, the similarities to the debate process over, what parts of text are valid, like how that parallels to what we do in modern American society, specifically in our political conversations around the Constitution. Thanks for joining. Thank you again, Dr. Penner, for sharing your wisdom. Thank you all for listening in, and we'll look forward to having you on the next episode coming soon.